It's such a honor to be here with Michelle. For those of you who haven't read her book, Reading with Patrick, you should totally read her book. It's a really compelling story. I found it really moving, and your idealism really shamed me, because you were going out to become a teacher in one of the poorest, districts of this country, and I was writing books. I just wanted to tell stories and talk about stories, and it's so crucial that there are teachers and idealists who are out there to change the world and to write books that illuminate these different experiences. So really congratulations on that.
Thanks so much. That's so kind. And I just want to say we're all so thrilled to have you here for our 20th anniversary. I've been talking to people for weeks who can't wait to meet you. And this is the only community that I know of that is where your ticket in is to be a refugee or an immigrant, where we all have reflected on our journeys here, and we're all bound by the desire to give back. And as you probably know, we're from many different fields: education, music, medicine, law, business. I think all of us feel incredibly moved and aroused by everything that's happening today in immigration. So thanks so much also for your moving and profound address. And I just want to start by asking you a little bit about your experiences coming to this country. So I read that you were 4 when your mother basically walked with you and your brother 114 miles to a port, and your brother carried you for some of that way. What stories were told when you were growing up about coming here and coming to the country? And by the way, I just want to say that my parents definitely like my brother better, so I'm with your brother on that.
Yeah, I was the black sheep in the family, because imagine, I think you talked about this in your book too, but imagine the story that I just talked about with my parents being refugee shopkeepers and everything that they had endured. And they were refugees twice, because they fled in 1954 to the south of the country, and then again in 1975. So imagine me going to school, becoming an English major, and then trying to go home to tell my parents, yeah, I just want to study Jane Austen and the Romantics. That wasn't going to happen. And so what really made me into a writer, besides all the stuff that I talked about, was also becoming an ethnic studies major and doing stuff that was related to what you were doing in college, and thinking that stories had tremendous power, that stories were not just things that you read about in books, but stories could transform our lives and change our circumstances. And I wanted to write books, write stories, so that I could talk about what my parents had been through, talk about what Vietnamese refugees had been through, talk about what this country had been through. So basically, a little bit about my family was that in 1975, it wasn't just the 4 of us. We also had an adopted sister, or my parents' adopted daughter, who was the oldest. And in 1975, my dad was actually in Saigon on business, and then our town of Ban Ma Thuột had the distinction of being the first town captured in the final invasion of the country. And we were cut off from communication, so my mom didn't know what to do. So she made this life and death decision that she was going to leave on foot with my brother and me, and leave behind this 16-year-old girl, our adopted sister, to take care of the family property, because my mom believed that we would come back, which was not an unreasonable belief at that time. So we never came back. And I remember growing up, and there was one black and white photo of my adopted sister, and I thought at the time, I knew her name, and I knew she was my adopted sister, and I knew we had left her behind, but I thought, why did that happen? Who is she? And I grew up with this sense that there was a ghost in our family, an absent presence in our family. And I knew that this was actually completely normal in the Vietnamese refugee community. I could visit any household, and every household had these black and white photos of people who had been left behind. Everybody had left somebody behind. Yeah. And so to me, that's what made me feel as if what I'm talking about to you today, again, in a cocktail party conversation, most Americans have no conception of what this means. But for Vietnamese people, we take this to be normal. So I never felt that there was a special, some kind of special tragedy that had been visited on our family in particular. In fact, I felt lucky that all we had lost was one person who was still alive, because I knew so many people who had actually lost people forever. And that just gave me a tremendous sense of loss and mission to, again, tell these stories.
Yeah, and that's such a powerful theme in your book, The Refugees, which I cried my way through this book. I just love this book so much. I love all your work, but I think that's the one where I cried the most. And in the book, you have this amazing epigraph that's about this very idea of ghosts. And maybe you can talk a little bit about why it spoke to you. It's from James Fenton, and I think it goes like this. It's like, it's not memories that haunt us. It's not writing that haunts us. It's what we forget, what we must forget, what we go on forgetting. And it seems to me a little bit about exactly what you're talking about, the constant presence of these ghosts of these other lives that didn't make it.
Well, I think that, I'll just speak of my own personal experience, because I think there's a relationship to the national experience too, which is, of course, I knew when I was growing up that this stuff had happened. I knew that we had left somebody behind. I knew that I'd been separated from my parents at 4 years of age. But in order to survive, I had to suppress all of that. I had to sort of think, that's a fact, but it doesn't mean anything to me emotionally. I have to move on with my life. I have to contain things. I have to become the model minority and all this kind of stuff. But in order to become a writer, unfortunately, you have to go where it hurts. You have to, most people go to see a therapist, but writers just have to sort of go there and dwell on the things that have caused them pain. And most people cope with it through other methods, but as a writer, you have to go and you have to look at these things that have haunted you, and these things that you think you remember, but actually you have forgotten because you suppress them. And because you suppress them, you forget all the little details too. So the more I think about this past that my family went through in the 70s and 80s, the more I realize all the other stories that accumulated around it of my childhood that I have forgotten about as well. And I think the relationship to the national culture is that it's a very similar experience. So of course, we know that slavery happened, for example, but we as a country have spent a lot of energy suppressing that knowledge at the same time. So it's a fact in the history books, but it's not a fact that's meaningful in the lives of so many people in this country, which is why then we have eruptions all the time around slavery and its legacy in Charlottesville and Black Lives Matter and things like that. And we will continue to have these kinds of eruptions because we have not actually dealt with our past. And likewise, I think when it comes to the Vietnam War and my own family's history and the Vietnamese refugee community, we haven't dealt either as a nation or as a Vietnamese refugee community with that history, which is why today, I think this is the explanation why only 29% of Vietnamese Americans believe that we should welcome Syrian refugees. Why do they believe that when half the country does believe we should accept Syrian refugees? And I think the answer is that Vietnamese refugees are so tormented by the history of the war and by their own place as people who are despised in Vietnam and who have an ambivalent status in this country that they can't bear the idea of associating with a new stigmatized population. Vietnamese refugees haven't dealt with their past, and they're taking it out on other people in the present.
So what was your process of coming to write and to speak out? Because I remember being struck when I went to a high school friend's house when I was growing up in Michigan, just by how freely people talked about protest, about the civil rights movement. There's this great moment in one of your short stories where it's a ghost writer and she's talking to her mom and she's like, "Mom, I just wish my name could be on this story." And the mom is like, "What are you talking about? People who write will go and get tortured and the government will disappear them." And I remember my parents thinking that my mom was always like, "Don't write about politics, don't rock the boat, just stay away." Was it ever difficult for you to come to write and speak? As a refugee, does a person have to decide what their relationship is to a government that takes them in? Does one come to think that being American is to hold America to its ideals?
I think we share a similar history, because your parents came out of this history of Taiwan with its own political repression and so on, and so it was dangerous to speak out and be associated with politics. And likewise, that was the same fear for Vietnamese refugees. We came from a country that was politically repressive, and you were not supposed to trust the people in authority. During the 80s, when these crimes were happening in the Vietnamese refugee community, the Vietnamese refugees wouldn't call the police because in Vietnam the police were the ones who came and tortured you. So for me to become a writer was because I grew up as an American and because I felt, you have to tell these kinds of stories, you have to speak out. And the trajectory that I followed is a very basic trajectory, which is we have been excluded in this country. We have been discriminated against. Our histories have been erased, in the histories of the Vietnam War, because when Americans say the word Vietnam, they really mean the Vietnam War, and when they say the Vietnam War, they really mean the American War, and what it meant for Americans. So there's a huge impetus for me to try to tell the stories of people who I felt had been erased in Vietnam and erased in the United States. But I think the real breakthrough for me as a writer came when I realized that that's actually not enough. This is the basic trajectory for writers of color in this country or minority writers, but we have to go beyond that. And by that I mean, the more I looked at the Vietnamese community here and in Vietnam, the more I realized they all feel that they have been erased by history. They all want to dwell on their own wounds. They all want to dwell on the things that have been done to them, and very few of them want to think about what they have done to others. And that is what we need to also think about. Of course, we need to think about the harm and the damages that have been done to our community, whatever that is. But we have to also acknowledge that in the complicated realm of history, very few of us are innocent, and very few of our communities are purely innocent, and very few of us are only victims. And that's the next step, right? And this is a step that even this country as a whole has had a problem dealing with. Americans would rather see themselves as victims rather than to acknowledge the things that they have done inside this country and outside of this country.
That's such a profound point, this idea that we have to give up the idea of our innocence, right? Both personally in terms of our own lives, how we're implicated, and then also historically. And this is something that you write really powerfully about, the moral luck. You write about how if you have this quote where you say, if I had been Haitian in the 1970s, I wouldn't have been admitted as a refugee because I was black and poor. If I were Central American today, I wouldn't be admitted as a refugee, even though the US has destabilized the region. You insist on these historical reasons that shape who gets to be a refugee. And I think everybody in this room is deeply aware that we're very morally lucky, to be here and to be able to do the work that we do. What is our responsibility in the face of that luck? And I guess related to that, being a writer is sometimes uncomfortable because one has to close the door to create. When do we know when to just open the door and obliterate whatever private rituals we have to create?
Those are hard questions. I think that to the first question about moral luck and responsibility, I think one answer to that is we can't afford to be sentimental. And that's why I'm saying, that's why in so many of my public talks, I criticize the United States, I criticize Vietnam, and the Communist Party in Vietnam, but I also criticize my fellow Vietnamese Americans. And this is not something that I think we're typically expected to do as the so-called representatives of our community. We're supposed to speak for our community and so on. But what does that mean? To speak for the community, we have to do more than that. The reason why I think that it's important to speak for minority communities in this country is because I'm committed to the idea of justice. And injustice has been done. Right? And what drives me as a writer is the idea that writing is an act of justice, which means that it's more than an act of simply speaking up for one's community. It's an act of speaking up for one's community when an injustice has been done to it. But if your community has done an injustice, you have to speak to that too. Which is why I go around and whenever I talk to Vietnamese people, I say, you know what, Vietnamese people, you are racist. I'm telling the truth. You know that Vietnamese community, some Vietnamese people in the community are racist towards other people of color. And we have to acknowledge that, right? And so that's how we address, one of the ways in which we address our moral luck is to acknowledge our responsibility, to acknowledge the complexity of our communities, and to be more than simply people who are rallying for our community and not rallying for other communities. We have to be interethnic, we have to be interracial, we have to be committed to solidarity. These are all the types of principles that allow us to get beyond victimization and a sense of attachment to our own identities and be committed to a broader cause that includes uplift for all Americans and includes an acknowledgement of the role of the United States in so many problems in the rest of the world as well. Now, so far as closing the door goes, it's actually pretty easy for me. I don't like people. So unlike most of you who are probably very social people, I actually I just like sitting in a room by myself writing books. But I also feel the responsibility for opening that door too. I was an activist at Berkeley. I was not joking. Literally, the moment I stepped foot on the campus, I was radicalized, and within one semester, I'd been arrested on campus for various kinds of political causes. I became, yes. So it's not a stereotype. We really did this kind of stuff at Berkeley, and that sense of activist conviction, despite my joking, has never really left me. I just left from this retreat for Vietnamese writers that I helped to organize in the mountains above Palo Alto, for the diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, because I believe that even for those of us who are writers, and basically as writers, our only task is within our own minds. Even so, we have to be about more than ourselves, right? We have to be about creating opportunities for others. And as a writer, I try never to sort of to take responsibility for my own work as if suddenly I just emerged and I was writing books and I got all this recognition. I always talk about how it would never have been possible for me at this moment in history to do what I have done without all the other writers and struggles that have gone before me.
I love that you write about that really powerfully, about how minority paths have forged a path for you. And you write about it with such humility. Like, you talk about how prizes and all, you wrote that prizes and all that they symbolize about our vanity, our judgments, our prejudices are ephemeral. And maybe you could talk just a little bit about that, about how life has changed with recognition. Has it changed your relationship with your work and your family? Is it uncomfortable at all?
Yes.
And I should add to this that a lot of people in this room, especially for those of us who aren't in lucrative professions, who have parents who crushed our artistic dreams, raise your hand. I think recognition is a way that we get validation from our parents, even though we know it's totally, ephemeral.
Okay, so my parents. I have to say, my parents are very conservative people, but in one respect, that they were liberal. They believed in education, and when I said I'm going to get a PhD in English, I said, okay, well, at least it's a doctorate of some kind, right? And but they were like, throughout graduate school, they're like, your brother did his doctorate at Stanford in 4 years. How long is it going to take you? So I was always like, I got to get a job. And when I got a job as a professor, they're like, okay, at least it's a job. We don't know what you do. We don't really care, but it's a job. But I never told them that I was going to become a writer. So that was always a secret. And then they gradually emerged, and I'm like, okay, well, that's fine. And then I won the Pulitzer Prize, and and I'll tell you something. I was on the road when it happened, actually, and it literally never crossed my mind to call my parents and tell them that I won the Pulitzer Prize. Because I thought, I'm Asian, that's what you're supposed to do, right? And so 2 days later, I'm still on the road, my dad calls me, and he's a very stoic man, not emotional, but his voice is positively shaking with happiness as he says to me, the relatives in Vietnam called, you won the Pulitzer Prize. Okay, so this is what recognition means. I mean, like, Vietnamese people, they have not read my book, many of them, but they know about the Pulitzer Prize, and they're going to take credit for it, and I'm perfectly happy that that's going to happen, and that's what that means. I mean, it means that the Pulitzer Prize and all the other stuff has obviously changed my life in a material sense and all of that kind of stuff. But I'm happy that it means that other people feel that my work somehow stands in for the community. And so one of the greatest gratifications for me is that when something happens to me, other people said, yes, this is a victory also for Asian American studies. This is a victory for Vietnamese Americans, that the stories that I tell or the op-eds that I write are not about me. They're about these communities that we're all a part of and that we're committed to as a collective struggle. And so what happened to me after the Pulitzer Prize and so on was that, yes, all these new opportunities started to happen, like to write for the New York Times and go on TV and all that kind of stuff. But I myself felt like I hadn't changed. All that changed was, and I hate to use these words, the platform and the brand had changed. But I said the exact same things after the Pulitzer that I said before the Pulitzer. It was simply that now I took the opportunity to say the same things that I had said before with utter conviction. And I tell people, you know, you don't wait for things like recognition to allow you to do things. You do the things that you believe in with conviction. And when they get you the recognition, you continue to do the same things with conviction, but with greater amplification. And I felt that meant that, you know, the message and the stories that I've been saying about the need for solidarity, the need for recognition, the need for collective struggle, the commitment for justice for all, these were all things that I believed when I was 19, and I'm still saying them today.
I think that's a perfect note to end on because we've run out of time. We're so honored and thrilled that you're here, Viet, and thank you for your humility, your sense of humor, and your political passion.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you to all the Soros Fellows, and thank you to the Soros Family and Foundation as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for those wonderful questions and the conversation. Yeah.